All right, is this on? Can everybody hear me? Yeah. Well, thank you all for being here today. I know we had a really productive morning, at least I did, and hope you did as well. We've got a great panel, really interesting and very timely conversation for the next hour, and I know everybody has constrained timelines and places they want to be right at 3 o'clock, so we're going to try to get this underway as quickly as possible. I am Shant Boyajian. I work for the Nossaman law firm and have had a really interesting exposure to some of these federal issues over the course of my career thus far. Before joining the firm, I worked on Capitol Hill on the last 2 transportation authorization bills, and you know, right now I think we've got a really unique opportunity facing us as a country. You know, during the presidential election cycle, you know, we had both candidates talking for the first time about infrastructure in a really specific way, and that's hasn't happened before. And obviously, the president has mentioned numerous times the importance of infrastructure. You know, there has been some maybe cognitive dissonance is the appropriate term about where P3s fit into the administration's infrastructure plans. You know, right now, we know that, you know, they are working on a plan. We've got some information publicly about what it's going to entail. We had Jim Ray here this morning talking with some detail about that. But, you know, we also see in Congress right now a tax reform effort that does not include infrastructure in a meaningful way, but what it does is, at least in the House bill that the House has passed, eliminate private activity bonds allocation. And so there's a lot of things that are going to impact infrastructure in this tax reform bill, even though it doesn't explicitly address you know, the overall more comprehensive infrastructure package that the president has been discussing. What we want to do for the next 50 minutes or so is really talk about, you know, really get a little bit more specific and talk more details about specific infrastructure classes and what the federal government can do, both from the administration's perspective as well as on Capitol Hill, to promote the utilization of P3s for specific infrastructure classes. And we really have a phenomenal panel today. Next to me is Jeff Ensor with the Maryland Transit Administration. Jeff is the Director of Project Delivery and Finance and the Chief of Staff for the Office of Transit Development and Delivery. In that role, Jeff leads the New Starts team and the commercial and financial aspects of delivering MTA's major capital projects. And you know, most recently, I was able to work with Jeff and his colleagues on the Purple Line in Maryland. And the last thing I want to note about Jeff is he recently served as the chair of APTA's P3 committee and has a really deep breadth of personal as well as institutional knowledge about P3 issues in transit. Next to him is Charles Brittingham. Charles is a senior VP with Cassidy and Associates. Charles and I have worked together for years and years on Capitol Hill on infrastructure legislation, and the number of bills that Charles has played a leading role in is really astounding, and so I'm not going to list them all off, but suffice to say, every major water infrastructure and transportation bill over the last 7 years, longer than that probably, 6 years, Charles has had a leading role in developing, and so he's going to talk specifically about water infrastructure issues today. Next, we have Nick Donohue, who is the Deputy Secretary for the Virginia DOT. In that role, Nick is the Director of Intermodal Planning and Investment, where he leads the development of the Commonwealth's Long-Range Transportation Plan. And prior to serving in that senior position with Virginia, Nick was the Legislative Director for Transportation for America, as well as the Assistant Secretary of Transportation under Governor Tim Kaine's administration. And finally, but not least of all, certainly, is Sam Barend with AECOM. Sam, as many of you know, is a legend in the social infrastructure space. She's the VP and P3 Director of North America and the Development Director for AECOM Capital. And she really, as I said, is probably the single expert in social infrastructure P3s in the country right now. She's the founder of the Performance-Based Building Coalition. And earlier in her career, Sam served as the executive director of the New York State Commission on Asset Maximization. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to each of our panelists to make some introductory remarks, and then we'll get into a discussion.
Great. Well, Shant asked us if we could provide a few quick thoughts about some of the things that could be done to help promote P3s, make more P3s viable in the country, and what the federal government can do. And so just with a couple thoughts on that in the transit space, I think I'd start off by saying that the question that I get more often than any other one from people in the transit industry, and that's, why would you do a P3 if you could just borrow state money or, borrow tax-exempt financing for it, or just do it on a pay-as-you-go basis? And, and you can start talking to them about, well, you have to look at whole life cycle costs and risk transfer, net present value. And some people get it. And a lot of people quickly get lost and start getting skeptical. And so, and the thing they keep coming back to is, the cost of capital. So when we talk about private activity bonds and potentially losing those as a tool, that's a pretty critical thing that I think would have a dampening effect on people's interest in doing public-private partnerships. There are other things that the federal government could do as well. And really it comes down to things about time and money. So when it's time, it takes a long time to get through all the federal reviews when you're applying for a federal low-cost loan like the TIFIA program, or you're trying to apply for a federal grant from the FTA's capital investment grant process. And there are opportunities to streamline that, which we can get into a Q&A if anybody wants to, but by leveraging some of the reviews that maybe TIFIA does and applying those to some of the FTA New Start's capital investment grant application process. Another thing that we could possibly do is lift the 33% cap that's applied to TIFIA loans for projects, which, statutorily there's some flexibility, but in practice, a lot of times the US DOT, understandably, tries to keep their leverage low, but the more you can increase TIFIA, which is a very great tool for P3 projects and public project sponsors, the more we could help reduce the cost of capital and help everybody see some of the financial benefits. So I'll keep it real brief and happy to talk about more during Q&A.
Great. Charles?
So I'm going to discuss it from the water resources side. And I'm going to give you a stat here. I spoke in Norfolk a couple weeks ago and listened to the Army Corps of Engineers tell me that they have a $96 billion backlog of projects. That includes ports and waterways, locks and dams, flood protection, so on and so forth. What they're not telling you is the vast majority of that $96 billion is not budget eligible under ONB's construction performance guidelines, which means when ONB puts their budget together, they require a benefit cost ratio of 2.5 to 1 at 7%. But many of the cheese reports authorizing projects were not authorized at a 7% discount rate. Many of them were authorized at a 3.65, a 3.5, 3.25, whatever the discount rate of the day is. So out of that $96 billion worth of projects, in reality, only 15 to 20 billion are going to be budget eligible. So what does that mean for the other 72 billion out there? That means we need to figure out ways legislatively, politically, to open up the markets for that other $76 billion worth of projects to get constructed. And I'm not going to sit up here and regurgitate the House Transportation or House T&I Committee's report on P3s or the Texas Transportation Institute or the American Society of Civil Engineers. We all understand the ring fencing problems. We all understand OMB budget scoring. We understand the Anti-Deficiency Act problems that exist, as well as revenue raisers and the other political challenges that are going to exist. What I'd like to do and what I'd love to encourage people to ask questions on is how do we fix this? How do we move those projects, those $72 billion worth of projects, how do we move those to construction? And I know we're talking about how do we get the feds involved. In my personal opinion, I believe we have to marginalize and get the feds out of the process for water resource projects. The Corps' budget isn't going to get any bigger annually. I mean, they're roughly $4.5 to $5 billion a year annually, and it's been pretty consistent for the last decade. And out of that $5 billion, approximately 1.2 to 1.5 is for construction. Well, if you've got a $96 billion backlog, that 1.2 to 1.5 billion isn't going to cut it. You're just going to get a drop of water, just a drip, drip process on getting these projects constructed. So I think moving forward, we've got to be bold. We've got to look at things like deauthorizing certain federal projects. We've got to look about removing the prohibition on tolling or modifying some of the restrictions on ports and waterways charging fees. You know, and I can tell you this, there may be some inland waterway folks out here that are probably going to light themselves on fire when I say it, but you know, charging tolls or fees on our inland waterways to move some of those, you know, billion-dollar projects off the books, that's something that's going to have to be put on the table, as well as getting some of the other users of the inland waterways, getting those people to pony up as well. You know, it's critical that more than now that we take a very hard look, because some of the actions that I was culpable on in Congress, some of the actions that were set in place, these projects that have chief's reports, and I had a conversation in my office about one that doesn't have the requisite BCR, will not receive a federal dollar under the current OMB budget prioritization. It'll never be constructed, and then it will be deauthorized, and that project will no longer be in the federal books. So moving forward, we've got to look to tackle, be bold, tackle the political challenges out there, remove some of the prohibitions, remove some of the restrictions, you know, allow for long-term contracting to get these projects done. So.
Great. Nick?
Thanks, Charles. Thanks, Sean. So Sean asked me to come here today to talk about, you know, highways, and I think there's been a lot of interest by the private sector over the last 10 years about really finding opportunities to invest in, you know, highway projects, and what I mean by that is really toll roads, whether that's by revenue risk or availability payments. I think one of the big issues that most of the folks in the private sector find is there's not as many public sector partners willing to engage with them on these deals. And one of the biggest reasons there is when we're talking about a P3 on the highway side, whether it's revenue risk or availability payment, there's a revenue stream involved, and that revenue stream is almost always a toll. I don't know if any of you have ever dealt with tolls before, and I'd actually ask you just to raise your hand if you've ever proposed to turn an entire road into a toll road and what the reaction was. So I've done that. I limped here today. That experience was 2.5 years ago. Next Monday, we'll be turning I-66 inside the Beltway into all toll congestion pricing during peak period with no free lanes. So the entire road is going to be a toll road. That was one of the most difficult discussions we've ever had on transportation in Virginia, I think, for the last 30 years. I dare say it was as hard as the revenue bill that we passed in 2013. And so one of I think the core issue when it comes to P3s on the highway side is getting greater public acceptance of tolling. And candidly, I don't think the federal government is going to be the one who solves that problem. That's going to involve political leadership and courage by governors and other local elected officials who are willing to have honest and very, very tough discussions with their local elected officials, with taxpayers, with constituents, and with voters. Because that is what is going to make these projects really work moving forward. So I just really wanted to kind of start with that, because to me, that's the biggest issue on the highway side, in my opinion, when it comes to public-private partnerships. It's not federal incentives. It's not, you know, whether or not we have the ability to toll this or toll that. It's whether or not people who have the authority to impose tolls are willing to do that. When it comes to the federal side, though, I do think there are some things that the federal government can do that would either be very helpful or very detrimental. I think on the helpful side is, you know, we already have private activity bonds, hopefully, and hopefully those, you know, stick around. And we also have the TIFIA program. Those two programs are some of the most helpful programs that can ever exist to advance public-private partnerships. The sculpting and some of the other things you can do with debt service and the TIFIA program are critical for toll roads with their ramp up and other things that exist. I think some of the issues we really have with those programs today is the uncertainty. One, the uncertainty put in place by Congress talking about eliminating private activity bonds. We're currently working on several public-private partnerships in Virginia where our financing models and the term sheets we've put together with our P3 partners assume private activity bonds. We're talking about, you know, 100, 200 basis point change in project financing if those goes away. That's tens of millions of dollars, potentially hundreds of millions of dollars. I don't have that money. We are planning these deals within a certain envelope, and if that changes mid-course, it's not NEPA that screwed up my project. It will be Congress that screwed up our project by changing the rules while we're in the middle of a deal. Similarly, I think the TIFIA program, we need to have a discussion about what is TIFIA's role. Is TIFIA here to provide, loans with some risk to projects to advance greater volume and velocity of public-private partnerships and toll road projects? Or is it here to be more of an institutional lender that never makes a bad bet? You can't be both of those things. And I think right now, for the last few years, you've really seen the TIFIA program kind of debate, are we here to take some risk? Or are we really just an institutional lender that's going to demand really high standards? And I'll just give you kind of a recent example from the Commonwealth of Virginia. We went to financial close 3 weeks ago on the I-66 outside the Beltway public-private partnership project. $3.7 billion, one of the largest public-private partnerships in the country in recent memory, and I think the largest revenue risk toll road, I think, ever. Our PABs had some of the highest credit ratings ever. We weren't BBB minus, we were above that, one of the first new toll roads in recent memory to have that credit rating, yet we spent months with TIFIA debating whether or not that loan was creditworthy. We met all the requirements in code, we met all the requirements in guidance, yet we spent months having these discussions. I'm not going to get into the specifics because they're boring and too painful for me. Boring for you, painful for me. But I'll just say, after we closed with TIFIA, 2 weeks later, we went and sold our private activity bonds, and we were oversubscribed by 7 times. And those private activity bonds are subordinate and unsubsidized. We're subordinate to the TIFIA loan, and there's no government subsidy to those, or direct subsidy to those loans. And if the market is willing to buy those at 7 times greater than their availability, then I would say that our project was creditworthy. And so I think it's a real issue that we spent months going through the TIFIA process trying to get through there. Those are the good things and where I think the federal government has a role. I think it would be an awful idea for the federal government to start giving bonus payments or the concept of asset recycling to encourage states to do public-private partnerships. I feel that way for a few reasons, but I'll stick to just one. I think it distorts the market and undercuts the negotiating position of the public sector. The way we do P3s in the Commonwealth of Virginia, and just a quick side note, in the last 8 years, we've closed $10 billion worth of P3s with more than $2.5 billion in private equity, is we look at what it would cost the Commonwealth to finance that project, and we ask the private sector to beat us. We're not getting into the value for money analysis or any of those other things. We simply look at what can we do it for, and can you do it, give us a better deal. And if you can, great, and if you can't, no problem. We'll go do this project finance publicly. The concept of asset recycling or these other kind of incentive payments would really distort that market, because now the private sector knows that we only get this incentive or bonus payment if we do a public-private partnership. So if you think that concept through to its logical end, and I'll use an illustrative example, in I-66, let's say we wanted a 0 public contribution, it's a $3 billion project. Some of these asset recycling kind of concepts that folks have talked about would involve a 20% bonus payment. That's $600 million. If you're the private sector, you know I only get that if I do a deal with you. So I'm saying you can't ask for any money from me. But if you know I get a $600 million check only if I do a deal with you, you can now turn around and ask me for $400 million because I still get $600 million. So I'm $200 million off doing a deal with you as the private sector. As a Virginia taxpayer and a Virginia official, Virginia taxpayers win there because we've gotten $200 million. But the federal government has just spent $600, and $400 million of that was evaporated into the deal. And all it did was reduce the risk on the private sector. And so I just think the federal government needs to be very careful if they try and introduce new incentives or other distortions that are only available on one side of the deal, because you're going to hurt us at the local and state level where we're the folks on the ground actually negotiating these deals.
Thanks, Nick. Sam?
So I agree with almost basically everything that Nick has said, and I'm going to expand beyond transportation. I think that federal government plays a role in P3s in buildings, water, as was mentioned, and in transportation, all the way across the board. And all of us do a great job in going out and educating, and many folks are here today from municipal and state government and from the federal level. But and many of these projects occur at the local level now, but they're not occurring at the federal level, and that's, I think, what a big part of what this conference is about. Why aren't they occurring at the federal level? And that is because the federal government is not incentivizing and actually allowing P3s. There's a number of provisions in law that make it impossible, like all of the scoring rules that make it very, very difficult for agencies to move forward with the long-term contracts and availability payment or performance-based projects. Looking at leases as a capital lease as opposed to an annual operating lease, and the OMB Circular 11 that a lot of us are working on. So I think the federal role in looking at infrastructure coming forward, if there is an infrastructure bill, I think enabling public-private partnerships among all federal agencies to participate for federal buildings, for defense, et cetera. And then I think looking at how the federal government interplays at the municipal and local level. And as Nick was mentioning, it is imperative. These financing tools are imperative. We have tax-exempt financing. So with tax-exempt financing, you have to have federal financing tools. We've been able to do it a little bit on the building side. We've advanced 3 building projects so far, 3 or 4, but we haven't had the same sort of deal flow as they've seen in the transportation sector, because there are no financing tools that exist. These financing tools take this whole cost of capital argument that is inherent in every P3 from a CFO completely off the table. So private activity bonds are needed across all sectors, and we need the federal government to enable them. Right now, we only really have them in transportation and airports. We have them a bit in water, but it's very difficult to access. They're under the volume cap. So if you're a municipality and you want to do a water P3 project, you have to compete with, they're under a state volume cap that includes housing and student loans and all these other categories of bonds. And so getting access to them is very political, whereas transportation has a set allocation that's given at the federal level. And so transportation, almost 70% of the P3 projects that have been advanced in the US have utilized private activity bonds. It's been fundamental to the market. And so, getting this tool across all sectors is going to be key, and it's something we should all push for in an infrastructure bill. And, TIFIA has been expanded in the water sector, so now we have WIFIA, but educating municipalities on how actually WIFIA can function and making sure that it's not a bureaucratic quagmire to get access to it, like Nick mentioned on the TIFIA side, making sure that it can actually be used and not more trouble than it's worth. And then I think there are other things that could be done at the federal level that could be more administrative. DOT has a lot of flexibility to incentivize P3s, and whether it's not stipulating money behind certain projects that are P3, but really incentivizing it through a fast track process, making sure that the environmental process is more streamlined, that actually incentivizes folks to use, whether it's alternative delivery or P3. FHWA has taken a lot of steps in that direction. And then I think working to actually get more experts within the federal government who understand P3 and that have lived through and breathed through one of these projects is helpful. The BADC at the US DOT has been really helpful, and I think EPA is working to build more expertise there. So I think the more we can get that sort of expert level throughout government would be much better, and better able for the private sector to interact.
Thanks very much. So, if you think about how our federal policy has evolved over the last few decades, it's very responsive to, kind of the systemic issues relating to each mode of transportation, each infrastructure class. And I think we've seen a lot of the federal policies that have been used, the federal tools that have been used by P3 projects, are by and large mode specific. And, one of the things that I think presents a unique opportunity right now is that we're actually talking about doing an infrastructure bill outside of the normal transportation reauthorization process. And so I think that allows us to have maybe a broader discussion about some possibilities that are outside of the parameters of what you would normally be able to include in a traditional reauthorization bill. You know, I think one of the things that we can talk about now is, instead of looking at what the federal government has done and how to make it, like, make some little tweaks around the edges to hopefully improve it, provide a little bit more funding through the apportioned programs, and hope that that, you know, kind of keeps the finger in the dike for the next 5 years, what we can do right now is actually talk about what the federal government ought to be doing to actually, you know, really move the ball forward on P3s and maximize this tool in our overall infrastructure condition. So one of the things I want to ask you guys, you know, each of you mentioned a number of different things that the federal government could be doing. If the federal government were to, instead of, you know, to use Nick's terminology, sort of subsidize a certain delivery model, do you think there is more that the federal government could do to actually incentivize project sponsors to maybe take a more holistic approach to their project delivery and actually look at what might make the most sense from a dollars and cents perspective? You know, there's a lot of institutional momentum in public agencies anywhere, but especially with regards to our infrastructure delivery, you know, a lot of people have been doing the same types of projects the same way for decades. And, you know, there's obviously a funding issue with regards to our infrastructure right now, but I think part of the issue is also that we just haven't modernized the way that we've actually delivered our projects. And so I guess I'd just ask each of you, with regards to the types of infrastructure you discussed, do you think there is a way the federal government can perhaps incentivize, you know, infrastructure owners to actually look more at how they're delivering their projects instead of just focusing on a specific delivery method itself?
So, you know, looking at the whole life cycle, you know, a common way of doing that is like a value for money analysis, which is somewhat of a loaded term sometimes in the industry, especially when you talk to, like, you know, CFOs at a public agency. And it's, you know, it's a good tool, but, you know, our perspective is that it's one of many things that you should look at, and you certainly shouldn't make a decision whether to do a P3 based solely on a value for money analysis, because, you know, there's a lot of uncertainty in terms of the inputs that go into it. And as anybody who's like a modeler or a finance person knows, is, you know, any model is only as good as the assumptions that go into it. And you have to make a lot of assumptions to do that kind of analysis. So, you know, a lot of agencies are somewhat resistant if they're kind of if a requirement is imposed on them to look at, you know, saying, hey, before you do this, you got to do this additional step. And I know, you know, there are some proposals and ideas kicking around where, you know, that might be something that's required, but I think the strongest way to do that is you really provide a strong incentive to do it rather than a mandate, would be my recommendation.
Okay.
I think under the core civil works program, I think it's extremely difficult, in my opinion, to incentivize the non-federal sponsor given the funding constraints that exist. I mean, I mentioned it earlier about, you know, having a very static budget over the last decade, and, you know, when the local sponsors go through paying 50% of doing the study and then sitting around and getting their chief's report, you know, I think an incentive, but a negative, would be not using the Corps' current discount rate of today, but mandating that they use a 7%. Now, while this will weed out a lot of projects that exist out there, it will remove the false hope that I think is given to a lot of non-federal sponsors. You know, and I can think of several ports off the top of my head that go through an arduous 3 to 6 year study process. They get a chief's report, they do a ribbon cutting, and they're extremely happy that they have this port project, but in reality, it will never receive $1 of federal funding. So I think the incentive would be to clean up some of the core laws, you know, the civil works laws that they have right now, to try to modernize how they do things, you know, modernize how they do their national economic development process, which is kind of the precursor or the nuts and bolts of the chief's report, you know, and that BCR calculation. Modernize some of those, you know, Word of 14 and Word of 16, we kind of changed some of the laws that that dealt with non-federal sponsors studying their projects as well as non-federal sponsors constructing their projects. So I think we've made good strides in that department, but I think the NED process is unbelievably antiquated in the transportation cost savings and so on and so forth. So I think continuing to rehab and reform some of the laws under the Civil Works through the WRDA process would be key at this point. More importantly, give them additional dollars instead of the 1.3 to 1.5 a year. Give them additional funds. I mean, it's an infrastructure agency with no money. It makes no sense to me.
So I want to draw a distinction between what the federal government could do, which I'm not going to talk about, versus what I think would be appropriate for them to do, because I do think there's some differences there, as I talked about earlier. I think one of the key things is looking at their available programs where I think the federal government could create great incentives for public sponsors to consider all the delivery options, and I think a really key one is TIFIA. Right now, USDOT says, I don't care, Congress, that you'll allow 49% of an eligible project cost to be under a TIFIA loan. We're not going above 33%. I think USDOT should consider whether states go through a process where they evaluate different financing options without judging where they end up. Again, I think if you tell a state they only get money if they're P3, Virginia's done a bunch of P3s, Texas has, Florida has, Colorado's one or two, but the rest of these states, you're just going to get people to react negative if they think you're predetermining an outcome. So I think you need to have an open process with a level playing field where if a state evaluates how to finance a project and they look at all the options and they do it with some, a few key parameters, but every project and every state is different, so there still needs to be flexibility, then I think the TIFIA office should be willing to go above 33% of an eligible project cost when they're sizing the loan. And for those of you who haven't ever been through a TIFIA loan process or received a loan, just to give you an example of how significant the impact of the financing opportunities with TIFIA are, I told you I-66 is $3.7 billion. Embedded in that is the concession payment of $579 million to the Commonwealth of Virginia. If we had not received a TIFIA loan, there would not have been a concession payment on that project. So now think about that if we had been able to get a TIFIA loan for 49% of that project's cost. We would have received a concession payment probably over $700 million. And again, that's money we're reinvesting back into this corridor and other projects, to improve transportation in that area. So I definitely think, allowing folks to get a greater TIFIA loan size if they go through a process where they evaluate all options when it comes to financing. And again, if we end up publicly, you should still give that to us. If we determine as the project sponsor that that's our best option, because otherwise you're going to hurt our negotiating. I think the second thing is something you've seen the Trump administration do with the infra grant program. They have a discretionary grant program, and they have the rights within the bounds of the statute that Shant worked on to hand out $850 million this year. And they've made it pretty clear that they want us to look at life cycle cost, new revenue streams, financing, and P3s. That's very fair, and it's appropriate, if that's what they want us to push us towards. I think those are the ways to really try and do that where there's, new money and other types of incentives. I think it's a really appropriate way for the federal government to engage. But again, I really hope they don't predetermine outcomes and pick winners and losers when it comes to the financing tools.
I think you can't have a P3 panel without talking about Canada, right, Mark? So I think Canada has a great model that could be applied to the federal government in terms of looking at incentivizing P3 from, the federal government could say that in order to get money, if these major complicated projects that are getting, over X amount, whether it's over 500 million or what amount, it has to go through an assessment to determine whether or not a P3 makes sense. So you should look at design build, the whole gamut of alternative delivery approaches to determine whether or not a P3 makes sense. I think that would be feasible, and I think doing it as Canada doesn't predetermine, but they make sure you go through a sort of a rigorous, disciplined process to look at projects that are receiving significant support. And if a project is receiving significant federal money, there should be a disciplined look at what delivery method is going to be applied.
If I can make one statement, it just came to mind, we were talking about incentives. I can think of a particular multi-billion-dollar flood protection project in this country that, in my opinion, will never receive a federal dollar under regular appropriations process. When it went through the study process with the Corps, it got an environmental impact statement. It went through the entire NEPA process, but the locals have charged a millage tax on themselves, and they are building this project themselves, reach by reach, and I think there's probably 14 to 15 reaches. For each reach, they're having to go through a Section 408, a Section 404 permit to construct this project. Now that's ridiculous. You want to incentivize those locals, allow them to use the EIS statement, and don't require them for each and every reach to go through a Section 4 or a Section 408 permit.
Yeah.
I think streamlining the regulatory process, really not gutting it, but reforming it to the extent that it needs to be reformed, and particularly in this process, is a way to go to incentivize them.
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes back to what Jeff said initially, which is what the federal government does a lot of times impacts the time and money that project sponsors have to expend in order to actually deliver a project. Obviously the last few authorization bills have really tried to focus on the federal environmental review process, to a slightly lesser degree the federal environmental permitting process. The president issued an executive order on this issue, and really a lot of it is about implementing existing authorities. But Jeff mentioned something interesting. He talked about maybe looking at potential duplication of paperwork, using the same paperwork from TIFIA for a New Starts grant, for example. I'd just like to get the rest of the panelists' opinions on how that might look in some of the sectors that you've discussed. I mean, we talk about, on the environmental side, looking at using the same reviews and the same studies for multiple purposes. But I think looking at the different grant vehicles, the different loan programs that the federal government has, what could the federal government do better to make those products a little bit more transferable?
The only thing I can think of, with respect to water resources is EPA's WIFIA program. So, and it's an infancy program. I think this year or last year might have been the first year that it was started up and actually got funded. But I do think the duplicity that exists within inside, and I just mentioned it as part of the 404 process, that sort of duplicity when there is an authorized project, when the environmentals have already been done, I think, the agencies working well, whether it's the cooperating agency going through the environmental process or the lead agency, I think, that sort of pressure to get folks at the table at the same time, to get them all operating and not being duplicative. I can think of another port project right now that had an environmental statement done in 2007, and DOT was a cooperating agency, but now MIRAD is requiring an entirely different new EIS on a project that already has an EIS, and there were no changing conditions, there were no changing of the project, but 6 years later they're going to require an entirely new EIS. It's not money that's delaying the project, it's this sort of duplicity, particularly in the environment and the regulatory process.
So I'm going to be a contrarian. We're not running into these problems in Virginia. I think Shant, and before him, Alex Hergott, and before him, James O'Keefe, were extremely effective, along with Jim Timon, and some of the provisions they wrote into the federal highway title. We are going to go from initiating a Tier 1 EIS on I-66 to cars using the express lanes in 10.5 years. So I don't know where these states are that are stuck in NEPA for 12 years. I would just respectfully suggest you need to hire some new consultants. So, for example, on 66, we're doing concurrent Army Corps NEPA work. They're in the room when we're doing our EA work. It just makes sense. You may not like what they have to say, but they got to issue a permit. So just kind of plugging your ears, turn NEPA and saying, I'm not going to listen to you, you can't tell me what to do, that's not really a good way to move forward, in my personal opinion. And so we do concurrent agency reviews. We bring them in during the environmental process, and we move forward. And when they raise an issue, we'll push back. You challenge. We don't always agree with everything that's said, but we get the projects moving forward. We did a P3 procurement concurrently with getting our ROD on the EA for I-66. You can do these things if you do the work and plan up front. I think the biggest issue on the highway side is public acceptance of the project. It's not really, it's almost never wetlands or the other things that hold up a project, in my opinion. It's whether or not the public believes in and is accepting of the proposal you actually want to build. As DOTs, we like to blame the environmental process because they make us talk to the public, but when the public hates the project, it's not the wetland that stopped it, it's the public that stopped it. And I just think we have to recognize that fact. That being said, on some of these other things, I do think we need to have that discussion about TIFIA's role. I'm not saying I'm the policy maker who gets to decide what it is, but we've got to decide what it is. Again, it's either a subsidized borrowing program that is there to take risk, or it's not. And if it's not that, can we please take the money that's used to subsidize that and put it in some other grant program that I can then compete for and use as a state DOT official? You know, that money needs to be put to use. And it should either be put to use, putting loans out that have some degree of risk, or it should be put to use in the infra grant program or somewhere else where we can get more projects going.
Sam, Jeff, anything else?
I think they got it.
Okay. I think we have a couple microphones available. If anybody has any questions, we'd be happy to take those. I just ask that you please stand and identify yourself for the panel beforehand.
Hi, thank you. John Chappie, Oklahoma Department of Commerce. Charles, this question is for you. As you know, the McClellan-Kerr waterway is very important to the state of Oklahoma. You mentioned tolling the waterway, which is fine by me, but I'm curious what your thoughts on how the implementation of that tolling would be. Would it be at the federal level? Would it be at the state level? Is it something that you'd expect the toll would be charged by weight, by number of barges? Appreciate your thoughts on that.
I had a discussion about this a couple weeks ago. You know, I think there needs to be a hard look at, you know, currently, for folks that don't know, currently there's a diesel tax on the barge operators, the waterway operators. It's 29 cents that contributes to the Inland Waterway Trust Fund, which is then matched by general fund in some cases, most cases, and then allocated out to the projects that exist. And there's a couple projects right now on the inland waterways that are kind of chewing that money up. They have to look at the end user. Now that diesel cost, that cost is being assumed by somebody. So if you look at a system inside a state, or if you look at the system in totality, you have to look at a way that, are you charging the commodity? Are you charging the value of the commodity? Like the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund is an ad valorem tax on the value of the commodity. You have to figure out a way who, not just the waterway operators, but who, what are you shipping? Coal, steel, petroleum products, chemical products. There has to be a real discussion with those folks to sit down and say, what will we charge at these particular locks or system of locks in order to do new construction or major rehabilitation? Because if you maintain the status quo, these things are going to start to fail. And you've got to identify with those folks, what does it mean to your business line if you have to deal with a 30-day shutdown on a particular lock for your coal commodity or your chemical commodity? I think the collection of taxes, though, would depend on the mechanism of whether or not you're divesting that particular lock to a state, such as the Illinois River. And don't anybody shoot me, I'm just merely putting out facts here. The Illinois River's inside the state of Illinois. That's it. Oh, well, the lock system, NESP, is inside the state of Illinois, where that mechanism would be done, probably most likely through the state would be the most preferable route. But then you have other locks and dams that, you know, are on the Ohio side or the Kentucky side or on the upland, the upriver section, and not necessarily, you wouldn't charge the fee on the downriver side. So I think there has to be a holistic approach, or at least a program where you're looking at a particular set of locks and dams within inside the state and figure out a mechanism for a fee collection, but you also have to identify what those fees would be and who would end up paying them. I hope that helps answer your question.
While we're waiting, you know, one of the things that really drive the P3 delivery model is obviously a revenue stream. It doesn't have to be a revenue risk deal, but it could also be an availability payment, which, as Nick mentioned, is sometimes backstopped by toll revenues that the project sponsor retains. You know, obviously, there's not enough public funds to just pay as you go and fix all of our infrastructure assets across the country. But, you know, there have been situations where public pressure has, you know, caused certain states to kind of constrict their authorization to toll. It's caused a lot of problems with respect to certain projects that have been toll projects. What do you think, just in general, and what are your thoughts on ways to monetize assets in a responsible way, and how do you actually get the public support behind that when you know that the infrastructure is potentially able to fail without doing some kind of improvement?
I mean, the 800-pound gorilla in the room is the inland waterways, like I just mentioned. You know, and I was thinking when I finished my comments, you know, who puts the strain on some of the inland waterway projects out there? There's one in Lake Charles, Louisiana, that there's 600 commercial lockages annually. But between the months of May and September, there are 13,000 recreational lockages. But the recreational groups, they don't contribute to the operations and maintenance of that sort of that lock, or that it's a gate, but they don't pay for the maintenance of that gate. So I think when you're looking at this in order how to monetize it, if you're inside a particular state, maybe there needs to be a fee added to recreational boaters, to a boating fee. Maybe there needs to be something added to a fishing license or so on and so forth. But there has to be a different track of looking at particular revenues because it can't be borne by commerce in itself. So, and I don't think you can, I think divesting the asset right away is probably not the way to go. You know, I talked earlier about getting the feds out of it. And again, this goes back to the funding issue and the constrained funding. I think limiting the Fed's role as a regulatory role, particularly the Army Corps of Engineers with this respect, is fine. But I think prematurely trying to monetize that asset or divest it, I think is real premature with respect to the inland waterways.
Mm-hmm. Sam, you've had a lot of experience with different infrastructure classes. Do you think there are any lessons that you can take, you know, and help owners of social infrastructure that haven't really done P3s as a delivery model before think about novel ways to help attract and build a business case for a P3 with some of their infrastructure?
Yes, I mean, that's what the Performance-Based Building Coalition works on that pretty heavily, and I know a number of other groups and regional groups are focused on that. I think, you know, in the absence of financing tools, there have to be novel ways to deliver a public-private partnership. And on the social infrastructure side, you're seeing municipalities look at leveraging real estate and putting real estate into the equation to deliver the project. So looking at getting more value capture from underutilized assets and land, and figuring out how to bring in a developer to you know, take advantage of this underutilized property, or to develop more land for them, and in exchange also pair in a public-private partnership project. And we saw that with Long Beach Civic Center is a great example of how that could work, and the work that Plenary and Johnson Controls are doing there. More and more municipalities are looking at how they can take this model and bring it forward, where they're actually, you know, in Long Beach, they're getting a lot more for the same amount that they were paying to operate and maintain an existing building. They're now getting a brand new building, and they're getting a tremendous amount of development through the region there that they didn't have before. So how can you, you know, really leverage an asset and capture more value by teaming up with the private sectors is the message that we're trying to communicate, or that should be communicated at the local level for social infrastructure projects. It's a little bit of a different model, and getting infrastructure funds more used to this, because this is not the norm in Canada. It's not the norm for traditional P3 social infrastructure projects, and it's getting infrastructure funds to be more accepting of taking on some of the real estate risk.
Mm-hmm. Nick, I know you had a comment.
Yeah, so I think there's kind of two issues here, and one I just don't know how to solve, and that's that engineers don't like to let bad things happen. And so, you know, when we say that we have shortages of funding on the highway side, and we're not going to be able to maintain our assets, engineers tend to find a way to make it work. We tend to not do something else that would be of value, but they typically find a way to make it work. And so I think, you know, the public hears that there's we have an 18 billion, you know, make up the number, really big, of course, backlog, and say it's just going to be awful if we don't solve this, and then we don't solve it, and then magically those engineers solve the problem. They studied for years at college to do it, and they're pretty good at it. And I think that kind of hurts sometimes when we're talking about, do you want to put a toll or monetize or get someone to make a tough choice because we've said something bad was going to happen if we didn't invest all this money in infrastructure. And bad things happened, they just weren't as bad as people maybe thought they were going to be. What we really missed out on was a lot of good opportunities and economic outcomes that we could have done if we had had those other revenues. I think the other really kind of tough issue is you're going to go to a politician and say, sir, I want to toll your road. And the first response is, well, just give me some of the money. Don't we pay taxes? Like, why can't I have some of that tax money? I should deserve that. We shouldn't be penalized with tolls. And I think that attitude really gets down to the fact that most politicians don't understand how their states or the governments, whatever, infrastructure class we're talking about, how they spend that money. And so they always think there's money that someone else is getting somewhere that should be theirs, and therefore there shouldn't be a toll on their road because they're just not getting their fair share. And so, one of the things that we've done in Virginia, and this is going to get back to your point, I promise, is we put in place this prioritization process for all of our new capital projects, where every year we get every project, we score them. We just pick the top scoring projects until we run out of cash. We put out a scorecard for every project, and then if you're below the line, we just don't fund you. So last year we had 400 projects. We funded 140. That means we told no to 260 people for their projects. And once we started doing that and they saw why we were funding the projects we were and that there just was this much money, it could only fund 140 of the 400 projects, we only have one interstate in Virginia that by law we cannot impose a toll on, and that's I-81. And that was put in place in 2008 in a backlash to a P3 proposal to toll the road and add 2 new lanes in every direction. Since we've gone through this prioritization process and now that the lawmakers see we're using the money wisely, understand that they're getting their fair share, it's just that the pie isn't very big. We were at a public hearing, I think just 2 weeks ago, and one of the sponsors of the bill prohibiting us from tolling I-81 said, I'm going to start polling my constituents. We may need to start looking at tolls here to fix I-81. And that's because they were confident that they were not getting cheated. They knew how the money flowed, they knew where it was spent, and most importantly, why it was spent in those places, and they couldn't argue with our logic. They may not have liked our decision, but they understood why we did it, and that it really led them to the place that the only thing they had left was, maybe we need to look at a toll. I'm not saying they're going to be happy if we actually talk about doing that, but it's pretty remarkable turn that in a period of 10 years, someone went from sponsoring a bill saying, you will never toll this road, to, I'm going to start polling my constituents to see if this is something we should do to make this road work better.
Are there any questions from the audience? All right, so I've got one final question, and we're almost out of time, and I know we could literally talk for hours about this, but Nick, you mentioned I-81 and the fact that there is at least some inkling of potential interest, perhaps, in the idea of tolling. In the DC area, a lot of us are from urban areas, and sometimes we lose perspective of what some of the other challenges are, the infrastructure challenges across the country. There are some states where, they have a relatively low population. Geographically, they're enormous, especially compared to some of the coastal states, at least on the East Coast. And they have a tremendous volume of assets that they are responsible for maintaining. They may have, at least on the highway side, they may not have as many passenger vehicles, but they have a tremendous amount of commercial traffic. And these truck drivers, these commercial truck drivers, need safe roads to drive on. And I was in a conversation with a state DOT CEO for one of the larger northern states, and he similarly has a prioritization process as you described, Nick, and is intentionally letting some of their roads go back to gravel because it's just it doesn't make enough business sense for them to actually maintain them. And so I just ask you really, each of you to kind of take a minute to go down the line and talk about what advice you would have for some of these more rural states, recognizing their unique infrastructure challenges and how some of the lessons that you have learned over the years could help translate some of their problems.
Well, I think, before we were talking about availability payments and, availability payment deals aren't perfect, We've yet to see, even in Canada, any of the availability payment projects, get to the end of their concession life. So there's kind of a question mark about how that's going to work in practice, 10, 20, 30 years from now. But, it does open up P3 delivery to a lot more types of investments than ones that purely have revenue risk. When you're certainly talking about, rural communities where you aren't getting a lot of traffic, or you're talking about types of investments that can't pay for themselves with a revenue stream, availability payment really would be the tool you'd have in order to, if your goals are, we want to pay for performance and we want to incentivize somebody to maintain it better than if we were to try to do it ourselves with the workforce that we have or the constrained budgets that we have. So I would advise them to talk to other agencies who've gone through it and done it before. And then if that produces some stronger interest, then they should certainly get some good advisors who've done it before to try to figure out if it makes sense for them. Right?
I'm going to be the turd in the punch bowl. Some of the rural states have got to raise their gas tax. I'm from the state of Louisiana. Their gas tax has not been raised in two and a half decades. Right now they're struggling. They got a $12 billion worth of backlog. The roads are horrendous. I mean, you can actually close your eyes driving in the state of Mississippi on 61, close your eyes and know when you're entering the state of Louisiana just because of the condition of the roads. I think the serious discussion needs to be had at state legislators. I know it's a tough political football, but they've got to look and start raising their gas taxes. I mean, even at the national level, they got to consider raising the gas tax.
I agree with Charles. Very honestly, public-private partnerships are really hard to do. They tend to be for, adding capacity and making the system work better. But if you're not even maintaining your current system, I would question the degree to which you'll be able to successfully enact a 50-year, deal with a private partner that involves financing, with people who do this all across the world. A public-private partnership, at least on the highway side, is basically marriage without divorce law. So you need to be really careful before you step into that relationship. And I do think you need to be a state that's doing a good job on your core functions. At least I would recommend you be doing a good job on your core functions before you enter into these, what can be very advantageous deals. But if you do them wrong, they will be unpleasant for a long time.
On that happy note, we are seeing P3s in, across all asset classes in rural and non-rural areas, but rural areas benefiting. So in Fargo, North Dakota, there's the diversion project that is in a partnership with the Army Corps, and it's a massive project, close to $2 billion. The UC Merced P3 program is benefiting. It's the $1 billion school university expansion program is to benefit the university is to serve rural students, and it's in a rural area. And then the Pennsylvania Bridges program, the Rapid Bridge Replacement Program, all of the short span bridges that are part of that, the 500 bridges that are being replaced, are all in rural parts of Pennsylvania. So I would urge, as you're all out and about, and if you hear politicians talk about that rural America doesn't benefit from P3s, that's just totally bogus. P3s can be done anywhere, particularly wherever you have infrastructure projects and where you have significant infrastructure needs, and there's significant infrastructure needs in rural areas, and maybe you have to bundle together programs, to bundle together schools, or what it be not, and they may not have the same number of possible P3s, but there are definitely opportunities. And we're seeing rural parts of America benefit right now from P3s, and they're significant signature P3 projects.
Great. Well, and there's certainly opportunity out there. So with that, let's give our panel a round of applause, and thank you all for your attendance.